tomorrow, go out and buy a blank journal and start keeping notes, because you're going to meet all of these cool people in your life. And you're going to find things out about them, you're going to learn from them, you're going to get these pearls of wisdom. Write them down, because if you just let them go, you'll forget them. And I did that. So I have 30 years worth of crossing paths with people like Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, John Chambers, Andy Grove, Jeff Bezos, Eric, Sergey, Larry from Google, so on and so forth. And I have this, one of these days I'm actually going to write a book. So what I chose to do for this presentation is I basically went through and I pulled out what I thought were lessons in life that if I could go back and tell myself, leaving high school, what would I want to tell myself, right? And I know you have to hear it about 10 times. I've got a junior in high school, and half of what I tell him, I know he doesn't hear, but anyway, hopefully some of these will stick. All right. I'm an engineer. I can do a chart. Okay, so you leave high school, college, right? This is your perception of your life, right? Everything's up and to the right, whether it's career, happiness, money, whatever, right? I hate to break it to you, but life doesn't work that way. I've quit jobs, I've been fired from a job, I've had illness in the family, I've had deaths in the family, stuff happens, right? And, reflecting on that, it's all of these things, the adversity that you go through that makes you resilient. And if life were easy, you'd never grow. And I've realized in retrospect that all of these dips, all these adversities that I went through, those were the things that shaped me who I am today, made me resilient. Those were the things, the life lessons that I pulled away. And just to remember, it's all about the trend line too, right? There's a wonderful book called Grit, G-R-I-T. And Grit actually spells this out. It's probably one of the best books in terms of resiliency, and I encourage all of you to read it. All right, so I'll leave that up there. I was at Amazon.com because people always ask me, they're like, oh my gosh, you were at Amazon during the early days. How did you plan that out? And I tell them, you won't believe the story. In 1996, I was living in Phoenix, Arizona. I was working at Intel. And I was 32. I was running a large plant for Intel. I had about a third of Intel's revenue going through my plant. I had about 1,000 people working for me. And I looked at my life and career, and it looked pretty good, right? And if I stayed at Intel, I probably would have had a good career. But something was nagging at me, right? I had no debt. My wife and I had just gotten married, so we didn't have kids yet. I wonder what it would be like to go to a startup. And what would that be like, right? So I called my father. Now, my father spent 36 years at IBM. And I said, hey, Dad, I'm thinking of leaving Intel to go join a startup. And he looked at me and said, what are you, nuts? I mean, what are you thinking? And I realized that his whole risk tolerance and his worldview was completely different from mine, right? I mean, he looked at, in his day and age, it was all about going to one company and staying there. Anyway, I got some other people's advice, and I still wanted to go down the startup route, right? So I put some feelers out through my network, and lo and behold, I got this opportunity to go to Seattle and work for Bill Gates for a startup that he had. It wasn't Microsoft. And I'm an engineer, so I've got, the first thing I do is pull out Excel, put the pros, the cons of going to Seattle, the pros, the cons of staying at Intel in Phoenix. My wife is not an engineer. In fact, I lovingly call her the anti-quant, right? And she said, hey, there's no amount of spreadsheets in the world that are going to help you answer this question. So let's go off to Cancun, and we're going to make our decision in Cancun. So we go to Cancun, and we're down there Saturday night. We're leaving on Sunday morning, and I was over 21, so this is probably not great role modeling, but anyway, we couldn't make up our mind. And I said, dear, I have no idea how to make this decision. And she came back with 2 shots of tequila and a quarter and said, flip the quarter. Heads Phoenix, tails Seattle. And it was tails, and that's how we ended up in Seattle. So, I find myself now working at the startup in Seattle. It's Bill Gates, right? How can it be wrong? It was a disaster. I mean, you know, we had more money than we knew what to do with. That was probably part of the problem, by the way. But we didn't have a business plan that actually closed, and there were all kinds of squabbling, and that's a story for another day. And I was miserable. I came home one day and said, I've had it. I don't think I can go into work another day. My wife looked at me and said, guess what? I'm pregnant. So, you know, now I'm sitting here going, okay, I mean, you know, the worst day of your life and maybe the best day of your life all wrapped up into one. 2 weeks later, a friend of mine called me and said, hey, you were at Intel, right? Do you know anything about like operations? And I said, yeah, I know a fair amount about operations. And he said, hey, I met this guy who's selling books on the internet. You should meet him. And I said, okay, what's the guy's name? And he said, Jeff Bezos. I said, okay, never heard of the guy, but yeah, sure, I'll meet this guy. So I met Jeff. Actually, at the time, Amazon was in the back of a methadone clinic. And it was completely, I went there and I told my wife, I'm gonna do this for a few years because there's probably a 50-50 chance that this thing's gonna go out of business anyway, and I'll be looking for another job. And that had a pretty profound impact on my life. So it just goes to show you that you don't, things aren't as they appear, and life is not uncertain or certain. All right. So I hope you've heard this. I'm going to say this probably the 100th time. We live in a bubble, right? There is untold wealth in Silicon Valley, and we live in this, you know, even compared to the rest of the country. One of the cool things about my job is I travel all over the world. You know, I travel to China and India a lot. And the thing that I try to remind my son, and I actually take him to these places, is, you know, the person who's got the least wealth in the United States lives better than the vast majority of the world. You're not going to find security. Money buys you security and it buys you options, right? But it'll never buy you happiness. I know a ton of people around Silicon Valley that have done really well financially, and I will tell you, I have an equal set of billionaires and you know, gazillionaires that are miserable and that are happy. And you know, so I've done an informal poll and said, you know, what makes people happy coming to work every day, right? Or happy in their life? And it's that they've got purpose. You know, so they actually wake up every day and they don't have a job. They actually have a purpose. They're going to work and doing what they love to do. And one thing that I tell my son is, you know, because he asked me, you know, so what's your definition of success? And I've said, it's easy. It's finding what you love to do and doing it really well. And if you find your passion and you wake up every day and that's what you want to do, that's awesome. That's success right there, right? And you know, life is not about money, but there's a high correlation to success and people doing what they really love to do. I worked for one of Google's founders. This guy's name is Urs Hutzli. He's a Swiss guy. You've probably never heard of him. He's kind of an icon in the cloud world. Urs is employee number 8. And I would venture to say that if you're employee number 8 at Google, you don't need to work. And I went into Urs's office a few years ago, and I have, you know, through Jesuit education and a German upbringing, I have a decent work ethic. Urs works harder than anybody I've ever seen. And I asked Urs one day, and I said, Urs, you know, how do you work like this? I mean, you know, you're in here all the time. You're sending me emails at all crazy hours. You're always thinking about this place. And he looked at me and said, this is not a job. This is what I wake up and I love to do every day. And he said, why do you come here? And I said, you know, pretty much for the same reason you do. I mean, I get to go to work every day and work with some of the most talented, smartest, driven people in the world. And fortunately, most of them have very low egos. So it's a fun place to work. We're not trying to kill each other. All right. You're all going to love, anybody that's a student right now is going to love to hear this. You're all thinking about hey, I'm going to graduate from this place and I'm done, right? Or I'm going to go to school and once I get my BS degree or my master's or whatever, I'm done. I hate to break it to you. Everything that you're learning, particularly if you learn in technology, is obsolete in, at best, 10 years. So you're actually just learning, going to school to learn how to learn. All the jobs that I've had since Intel didn't exist when I was at MIT. There was no dot-com industry. Google didn't exist. Who would have thought that, a company selling ads on a search bar could generate $80 billion a year, right? I mean, those jobs didn't exist. So, I'm an aerospace engineer, but I've got to tell you, I do nothing today that looks anything like aerospace engineering, but it had to relearn everything multiple times because that's just the nature of technology. And I would argue that technology is impacting every piece of the economy today. So you can't run away from it. And I think you guys know that better than I do. Humility goes a long way. There's a high correlation to the most successful people to being the lowest ego people. One of my favorite stories is I was having dinner with Neil Armstrong one night. And I asked Neil a question that I suspect he's probably been asked 100,000 times. Neil, what did it feel like to walk on the moon? What did it feel like to be the first guy to walk on the moon? I said, Neil, you are like the modern day Christopher Columbus. And he looked at me, completely deadpan, and said, I was doing my job. There were 400,000 people, engineers and clerks, technicians, manufacturing people. They were the ones who got me to the moon and got me back safely. I knew the risks. I was a test pilot. And I was just doing my job. And I'm sitting here going, okay, I've got to be honest. I'm a fairly humble guy. If I was the first man to walk on the moon, I don't think I'd be that humble. But it was this amazing, I was completely blown away by the fact that here's this guy who's completely unimpressed with probably one of the most historic feats in the last 100 years. Amazing. My favorite definition of leadership is finding people who are better than you, smarter than you, but actually want to follow you somewhere. And again, there's a corollary to that, which is when you go out and shape your life, surround yourself with friends that are actually better than you are. Case in point, I got a call from a friend of mine who's the CEO of a big company in St. Louis, and yesterday, and he said, hey, I'm struggling with this particular problem. I can't go into a lot of detail on it. He said, I just want your perspective on it. And it takes a lot for the CEO of a Fortune 500 public company to call somebody up and say, I need help because I can't figure this out on my own. And I thought that was an amazing, amazing thing. Okay, back to your friends. Find great friends and they will help you never stray from your ethics and your morals. I have seen a number of careers that were destroyed because they got away from the things that were most important. Whenever I go to a job or whenever I take on a task, the first thing that I do is I write down, what do I want my legacy to be, right? When I leave Google, what are the 2-3 things that I want to leave behind that when I come back in 10 years, I will have changed something indelible about that company. And I start working on that day one. And I've always treated life like that. And it was a great piece of advice that Andy Grove gave me. And finally, for you kids out there, I would tell you, thank your parents. I'm the first kid in my family to have ever gone to college. And I don't think I appreciated that my sister went to Notre Dame. We had actually 2 kids simultaneously. My father had 2 kids simultaneously in college. And I don't think I ever appreciated until just a few years ago the sacrifices that he made and my family made. But he didn't go to college. And he knew the importance of going to college. And I now respect the sacrifices that he made so that my sister and I could go to college. And that was, candidly, that is the thing that made all the difference. Going to great schools, and being able to apply that knowledge. So I'll leave that with you guys. I know we didn't talk tech, but anyway, hopefully you enjoyed it. Thanks.